Our two guests today, Vandana Hari, founder and CEO of Vandana Insights, and Dr. Aldo Flores, former Deputy Secretary of Energy for Hydrocarbons at Mexico's Ministry of Energy. Thank you very much for joining us this morning. Vandana, I'd like to start with you, talk a little bit about data and inventories inventory data that we've received and seen this week coming out of the US, both API and EIA, I should say. EIA crude stocks much more positive upwards than API. So what does that tell us about what's happening in the market?
Good morning, Dayala, and to all our participants in today's webinar. And just after noon here in Gurgaon, in India, where I am located today. As you quite rightly mentioned, a bit of a surprising build and sizable build in US crude inventories, as well as gasoline inventories. A very marginal dip in distillate inventories in the US reported by the EIA. So altogether, it was definitely a bearish report. To my mind, however, and I notice you've mentioned the EIA's impact in your headlines today, and you've also mentioned the Putin story. To my mind, the bigger factor in crude's drop yesterday was Mr. Putin, the savior.
Yeah.
Well, at least suggesting that Russia can and is willing to come to the aid of a gas-starved Europe. We get lots of things to discuss on that front with the Europe gas crisis and Putin, but just the highlights for me was that it was just words. On the ground, the reality, when you talk about physical supply and demand of gas, that didn't change, but just Putin's words appeared to make such a big difference. We saw a very quick, rapid sell-off in crude, clearly in gas markets as well. And I admit I don't look at coal prices that closely, but there was a very, very rapid sell-off. Even though physically nothing has changed yet.
Yeah.
And that tells me that it was basically a lot of speculative froth, at least in the oil market, which has subsided. I believe there is still speculative froth in oil, but a lot of it did subside yesterday.
And I mean, in terms of just the build that we've seen on the crude stocks specifically, I mean, how is that possible when at the same time we're talking about an energy shortage, in terms of actual, fundamentals on the ground, and that including obviously what OPEC is willing and able to do today?
Yeah, excellent point, Dayala. So first of all, the impact of Hurricane Ida. We might have almost forgotten about it now, right? At the end of August, but it was quite severe. The outages, especially upstream in the Gulf of Mexico, crude production in the US was down for much longer than what one might have expected. Mm-hmm. So throughout September, I think the huge drop that we saw in crude as well as refined product inventories, because let's remember the Louisiana refining capacity, more than 3 million barrels per day was out. And that took a long time to come back as well. So we saw the effect of that throughout September, but clearly now what we have seen this week and to some extent last week as well, the data that came last week for the week before, that US, the supply situation, both upstream and downstream in the US is starting to normalize. So I think that is one. The other, I think, is, this illustrates the dichotomy between gas and coal shortage. It's a gas shortage in Europe, it's a coal shortage in China, and to some extent in India as well, and oil. And I've been saying this and telling my clients over the past few weeks that, and again, links to my point about the speculative froth in oil, less than 3% of global power generation is based on oil. And for good reasons, power generation globally has been moving off oil since the 1970s, right? So it is, I think, the knee-jerk reaction of the market to think that just because there's huge coal shortage and huge gas shortage, people will just be able to switch their power plants or other applications that use gas and coal into oil. That just does not happen. At the margins, yes, Japan will burn a little more oil. Japan is equipped for nuclear power, oil, gas, and coal. Mm-hmm. India at the margins, a lot of people here, for households and commercial purposes, have diesel powered generators, which they always have as a backup anyway, because of the inconsistency in grid supplies, but it's at the margins. So, I think the EIA data again very clearly illustrates, certainly there is no shortage of oil in the US, but is crude reflecting that yet? Not quite. I see Brent is sort of, stabilized again this morning. Yeah.
Thanks, Vandana. Dr. Aldo, welcome again. To go to you just on OPEC, just to touch on their decision that they took earlier this week, not increasing beyond what was planned, despite obviously calls for more oil, shortages in the market, prices not peaking, but increasing, gas prices peaking clearly. Do you think it was the right decision for them to take? And do you think that and why did they take that? And has it got anything to do with US shale coming back?
On the last count, it could be, although there's contrasting and views on what will happen in shale. But I think the main thing is that what's going on right now, you cannot judge that it is a trend, that we are out of the woods. It's a very extreme moment, a very dire situation for energy consumers in Europe and Asia. But it is not the case that we're completely certain that demand will remain where it is right now, especially not as we're going to at least the fall. The winter will change, and we've heard so much about what might happen with natural gas demand as the winter approaches. But the driving season is slowing down in the US. And the COVID cases, while they have fallen in many areas, they still remain pretty high. So I think it was a prudent decision.
Give us a bit of an update about the COVID situation in Mexico, where you are, and also any viewpoints you may have further south from that. Obviously, South America was a big hot point for COVID, and has not been in the headlines recently, but we haven't heard of any recovery either necessarily on that front. How is that part of the world doing?
Correct. You described it just as it is. In Mexico, it has improved, but we have had a very strong third wave. It depends on where you are in the country. Similar stories in South America. But I can also point out to what's going on in the US, with such a large share of the population still not vaccinated. Pretty impressive. Mexico is quite integrated to the US, and certainly the south of the US and Texas. And that interaction creates a joint health system, to call it somehow, and that affects also the progress of COVID and of the recuperation of demand.
I mean, talking about the US in terms of supply, obviously, and putting shale aside, and clearly the indications are it's coming back, it's ticking back nicely, and in 6 months' time, if prices stay where they are, most people seem to think there'll be a significant volume back there. But the US has also been simultaneously pressuring OPEC for more oil, more than once. And there was a report earlier this week hinting that they may be looking to release some reserves from their SPR to calm prices down for their consumers. What do you make of that? Do you think that's likely to happen?
Well, the original design of the SPR had to do with the market oil disruptions, right? Supply disruptions. Is this a disruption? Not necessarily. About 10 years ago, it was used because prices had increased owing to a situation in Libya and the like. Will this be an intervention based on prices? It's a different use for the strategic reserve. Again, not unheard of. We'll have to see more what are the calculations that the US is making. As we heard from the US Secretary of Energy, they are considering all options. Mm-hmm. So we'll see.
Vandana, let's jump across to Asia. We'll go back to America to discuss some macroeconomics. But Asia, you're sitting in India and have the vantage point there of telling us what the situation 6 months ago. It was dire in terms of COVID. It's coming out of that major demand center along with China. So let's talk about India first and then China. What is the mood there, and how is the resurgence of activity impacting demand going forward for the next quarter or two?
Yeah, so just for the benefit of our viewers, you and I were talking a bit earlier offline about, and I was contrasting Singapore's approach and what's going on in Singapore, my adopted home country, and with India. 83% of Singapore's population is fully vaccinated. And yet the country is still in a very, very cautious mode. It's sort of like it adopted zero COVID. The population got used to the idea of zero COVID. And now when there are 1,500 daily cases, a lot of people are just extremely nervous. What a contrast, Diala, what a contrast in India. This country just has no time to indulge in navel gazing. Let me just put it that way. It's a country of 1.8 billion population. The economy has to be kept humming. Jobs have to be found. People have to be able to make a livelihood. There's a lot of, what's called a sort of a unorganized sector, where people are just turn up at the job, they get their daily wages, and they go back home and they buy their food and daily essentials with that. In a country like this, you can't just afford to stop. But exactly as you said, the worst of the wave was towards the tail end of spring and the start of summer in this country. Touch wood, the dreaded third wave, which was expected sometime in September, has not happened. And when I look, I personally, I've been extra careful since I came here. But I see people, for all practical purposes, just going about their lives. Yes, they're wearing masks. People are a little more conscious of maintaining social distancing. But the country is just humming again, which is the only way forward for it.
Okay, well, that's just as well, because the other largest now importer of energy, China, is not humming along. I mean, it's humming along perhaps compared to other OECD countries from a GDP point of view, but obviously relative to what it's been doing, and that seems to be a self-imposed restriction. I mean, as far as we know, there isn't a new outbreak of COVID in China. And yet, of course, it is imposing various restrictions on various sectors for energy transition reasons and for cleanup and other, obviously, financial control. And of course, if you have this gas crisis and coal crisis in China today, how concerned should the energy markets be about what that means, obviously, for demand and the pull on supply?
So let me just preface my comments by saying that, and we've been discussing this on this channel as well for the past few months, that Chinese economic growth was remarkable. The rebound was remarkable through the second half of last year, when the rest of the world was still struggling to emerge out of the COVID crisis. Since the beginning of this year, very clearly, Chinese growth has been decelerating. Now, one of the big factors for that, of course, there's a combination of factors, but one of those was that the Chinese government, perhaps a little bit confident that they're back on track post-COVID, began pulling back on debt and credit in general this year. So and that continues to a large extent. But the other thing that has been happening in China is just an avalanche of policy U-turns, of quite ham-handed, the way I see it at least, a ham-handed way of managing emissions. And I can understand to some extent governments the world over are getting a little more anxious to show a good report card, if you will, as we near COP26 at the start of next month. But China, thanks of course to a command economy just ruling by diktat, Beijing just told more than half the provinces, sent them stern warning that as of mid-year, they had failed to meet their targets to reduce energy consumption. They were also told to reduce coal production, to reduce coal burning. So to a large extent, China's coal shortage has been precipitated by the government policy.
Now they're trying to reverse that, right? I mean, they're telling coal mines to pump as much as they can.
Exactly. So that's an about turn. You know, the worst thing you need when the world economy needs when you're trying to get out of COVID and, you know, get your economy back on track again is such dramatic policy changes and policy U-turns. So effectively, the way I see it now, when the Chinese government tells its energy companies, just go out and buy everything that you need, coal, gas, oil, whatever you need, there should be no shortages in come winter. What is China effectively doing? It's exporting emissions, and it is exporting inflation, period.
Well, let's talk about inflation. Dr. Aldo, to go back to you and just talk a bit about the US first policy on monetary policy and what's happening there. And obviously, we're feeling inflation now in Europe. We're seeing cost push inflation everywhere on grains, on commodities, oil to an extent, but less so, one would argue. So in terms of the monetary policy, I mean, there's obviously been, some indications from the Fed that they're going to start to taper next month, but actually a lot of the markets now are even dismissing that, saying too little, too late. Monetary policy cannot fix the problems now that we're facing with inflation, with stagflation, some would argue. Would you agree? And if that's the case, what can be done?
I don't agree. I think it's too extreme a position to take right now. And by the way, I forgot to mention that was the other factor beyond what might happen with the pandemic. We have to see how the Federal Reserve acts, and if we see a round of interest rate rises, it will have an impact on demand, and therefore, it's wise to be prudent. Now, the interpretation.
Meanwhile, the debt ceiling continues to rise in the US, and the Treasury is begging for money almost. I mean, how long can this go on?
Well, it makes for a good cliffhanger, but I have my strong doubts that this is not going to be solved. But it's part of the negotiations right now, and we might see a little bit more of that. But I have my strong doubts that this is not going to happen. So the interpretation was and has been that this spike in prices was temporary and that it was not built into expectations yet for price formation, that it was not affecting contracts. We are more or less in that borderline where the interpretation will be changing. Are these definite conclusions that we're reading warranted? I don't think so.
I mean, the US Fed in its monthly meetings or statements, or when it talks to the market about what it's planning to do next, is saying, oh, let's see what happens to employment. That's one of the targets, obviously achieving a certain percentage. We have some figures coming out later this week on the latest employment figures. I mean, a lot of people would argue that it doesn't really matter anymore. First of all, they're expected to be positive, so that would indicate that there'll be, it'll push for tapering and interest rate rises, but that actually it's too late. Whatever the employment figures say, does it make a difference to trying to tackle these worries about inflation creeping in to economies everywhere?
Yeah, well, again, it's. I think we have to see a little bit more in terms of prices, and it has been a very extreme moment, no doubt. And it does raise questions and apprehension about where may they go, but it seems to me that a lot of this has been tainted, influenced by developments in Europe, and you have higher prices in the U.S. energy prices, but it's nothing like what you see in Europe.
Yeah, Europe certainly seems to be suffering much more directly so far. We have the survey question up today is the poll there. Again, referring to what we discussed earlier about the Strategic Petroleum Reserve in the US, will, it's looking to possibly release that to calm all markets. Would that strategy succeed if indeed they did it? So if everybody could cast their vote there, Aldo seemed to be a little bit skeptical whether it would be used in the first place or even be effective. Vandana, just to go back to you on the macro policy side of things, we saw New Zealand this week raising interest rates, the first, I believe, OECD country to do so. And there is the expectation that others are going to be doing so in the next few months. Again, do you see an urgency for countries to do that, taking into account what impact it's going to have on demand?
Look, it's a fine balancing act for central governments around the world. We already have about a handful of major economies around the world whose central banks have been increasing interest rates. And New Zealand, if I recall, had wanted to do it about a month or so ago, and then they had another outbreak and they pulled back. And that's a very good example of how central banks are almost walking on eggshells. Here in India, the Reserve Bank of India, the central bank, is also meeting and facing exactly the same problem. It wants to maintain accommodative policy, because let's face it, no country can say that our economies are now in a position to keep running on their own steam, right? If we were to remove all sorts of monetary stimulus, whether it's bond buying or whether it's low interest rates, no country is in that position. So I agree with your question that yes, central banks have to start looking, and some have already started doing it, but have to start looking. But I think they have to do it very, very cautiously. So one of the main reasons for caution, of course, was that we didn't know whether we have actually said goodbye to COVID. And I think what the Delta wave did was it delivered a reminder that, do not assume that just because you have vaccinated your populations, or you can just move on, you're COVID free. The second major problem for central banks.
Many people are saying, just on that point of, well, we haven't got rid of COVID, and the argument is maybe it'll never completely go away. Somebody earlier this week on our show was saying, oh, well, OPEC are just using that as leverage, as an excuse to sort of stick to their plan and not do more. They keep citing COVID, and yet COVID really hasn't done a lot to dampen demand this year. It hasn't really had that effect that we expected it to continue to have.
Yeah, I'll get to my comments on OPEC and what it says and what it does in a moment. Just on the second point for central banks, so one was obviously, caution necessitated by the realization that we don't know how much longer COVID is around, or the variants will keep coming. The second one has been inflation, and this energy crisis has made it even worse. So as RBI is meeting, they're really going to be scratching their heads. The biggest question here, and being asked by my clients in India as well, is that how worried should we be about this gas and coal crisis? Because India is feeling the brunt of it in gas prices, coal prices, and oil prices, right? So it's a really challenging situation for central banks, but for government policies for that matter as well. On the question of OPEC,
and when you talk to us about OPEC, Vandana, because we've got 5 minutes left, give us your view on what they've done, but more importantly, what do you expect them to do going forward? What is the OPEC plus policy going to be in the next 6 months through to April next year?
Yeah, I think going into Monday's meeting, as far as I saw it, it was almost a coin toss. That they will stay the course, or they will try to put some more oil into the market. On trying to put some more oil into the market, let's face it again, if they had said, okay, we'll perhaps put 100, 200, 300,000 barrels per day more, the market would have probably shrugged it off, right? It's basically oil has been in a state of panic buying. So there were some reports from Reuters the week before that perhaps they would do 800,000 and then just roll it over to December. I think first of all, it would have been a can of worms for OPEC. So that might be another reason they avoided even going down that path of putting more oil into the market. Because we do see that there's a whole chunk of both OPEC and non-OPEC allies were just unable to even produce at their current ceiling. So, then that opens that big question of, okay, if they're going to boost by 800,000 barrels per day, who exactly, if they're going to divide it equitably, which is how they do it always,
they can't.
They can't, exactly. They would have again fallen short of their new target by even more, right? So I think that it was a tough situation for them. I think Putin has done what probably needs to be done. You were talking earlier about, and Aldo was referring to what Secretary Granholm was talking about, perhaps we should release more from SPR, perhaps we should stop crude exports from the US. I think those are completely the wrong solutions. It's like throwing spaghetti at the wall. So I replied no to that survey question.
Yeah, and there you go. You're in the majority there, 62%. Of my glasses on, that's correct.
Yes.
Aldo, just to go back to you, just to zero in a bit on Mexico, and I believe there's a proposal at the moment. The government is considering turning back the clock on liberalizing the electricity markets. Tell us a bit about why. What's the thinking behind that, and is it the right time to be doing that?
Wow, well, in Mexico, discussions on energy have become polarized. And it was extremely difficult to get to this energy opening, the liberalization of markets that took place five, 6 years ago. And now we have a different government with a much more nationalistic view that has the interpretation that market liberalization was wrong, and very much focused on distributive aspects of this liberalization, and it's not privatization per se, but greater participation of the private sector in the market. So we have a very confused discussion in Mexico, in which ideology, not too much pragmatism, and very concentrated attention on who made money and who didn't with the opening, without considering that actual markets will take a while to work the way it was intended. And in any event, market design is extremely difficult for, especially in electricity, as we're seeing in the UK and other parts in Europe. So this is a very interesting and strange trend, if only because Mexico had managed to attract so much private investment and foreign investment, and because it does raise questions about the ability to continue to increase energy supply, period, from domestic means. That is the objective that the government is outlining. But by limiting additional investment, it's not so clear how it's going to happen.
And how is the oil production doing there in Mexico? We're talking about, OPEC and non-OPEC members having limitations, let's say, in terms of how much they can produce. Give us an update on that. That's obviously a sector that's been struggling.
Well,
because of production, more than anything else.
Production in Mexico has been steadily declining since 2004. Oil production, gas production, 2007, just about. And in the past 2 years, it has more or less stayed the same, but it's still much lower. It's 1.6 after having been at 3.4 million barrels per day. And it's not at this, we'll have to see if some of the private projects will come up with greater results, but that will take a while. Some of the projects from private companies that are coming on stream are around, together they make for around 64,000 barrels per day. Maybe next year they get a little bit higher, but it is not so, it's not going to be soon. And again, this reform, new or counter reform that the Mexican government is proposing, creates more misgivings among investors, precisely at a time in which more investment is required.
Vandana, I'll let you have the last word to wrap up for us today. Just week ahead, I know that we've got Friday tomorrow, the markets are open, but in the Middle East we're closed. Any sort of stats to watch out for next week, and also your expectations? We seem to have like leveled out on the oil price a bit this week, and are we expecting to hit that $100 in the next month? And what do you see for next week? Anything to watch out for?
Yeah, so I think I would keep my eyes peeled for what the EU governments do with regard to gas supply. I think Putin didn't directly refer to the Nord Stream 2, but it was a subtext all over his comments. Basically, he was saying, well, the solution is in your hands. Exactly. The pipeline is ready. Gazprom began flowing gas through it to test it. And my fear is that the EU governments and Germany, of course, Germany now needs to get its new government in place. That's causing a bit of delay, but they are bumbling, unfortunately, the need of the hour. And of course, they're getting conflicting messages as well, because you have the EC, European Commission officials telling them, don't overreact to this, don't stray from our climate policies and all of that. But unfortunately, I think the bumbling is going to prevent them from finding a quick solution to this crisis. I know that sounds horrible for the whole world that's paying higher prices for it, but that's my feeling. As far as China is concerned, I think the companies will do what the government has told them to do. So they will be buying everything hand over fist. The result of all of this is going to be countries which are very price sensitive, but need the energy badly. Countries like India, several economies in Southeast Asia these are all highly interconnected markets. Everybody pays pretty much the global price. Subsidies are gone for the most part. They are going to be bearing the brunt of this. And in terms of economic recovery, we saw the IMF in its last report raised its projections for India's economic recovery. But I think this is going to be, there was the Delta wave, and I think this could become the second major setback for economic recovery, especially for these very price sensitive economies.
Thank you very much, Vandana Hari, Dr. Aldo Flores. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to seeing everybody back here on Sunday morning. Thank you very much, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.